Now, if you like the movie 300, you're going to love this story. It's like that movie, but with cannons, knights, guns, an island fortress, and even more suffering and death. And like the Battle of Thermopylae, it's a small place where massive empires and cultures met at a focal point. And that focal point changed history.
This is Malta!
Now, we're not going to cover this like a movie. No fake beasts, no imaginary armor, people fighting in thongs and sandals. This isn't just a story about a battle. It's how one empire, arguably the single most powerful military machine at the time, got sent packing after a few months later by 500 knights, a few thousand farmers and fishermen, and most importantly, one extremely furious and badass 70-year-old man. This story has decapitations, a legendary pirate killed by a rock, and it ends, somehow, with a falcon. Hi, I'm Ian, and I don't know about you, but I am getting pretty sick of AI slop ruining storytelling on YouTube. If you want to support the troops, subscribe, like, and comment. Really appreciate it. The Knights Hospitaller started out politely as a charity, founded around 1099 in Jerusalem. Their entire job at the time was nursing sick pilgrims to health. They were sort of like a medieval Red Cross. If only the Red Cross carried swords and eventually annoyed several powerful empires at once. Over the next 400 years, they picked up land, money, warships, and even more enemies. And by the time they were headquartered on the Greek island of Rhodes, they've rebranded from a gentle nursing order to a heavily armed group of pirate hunters who also happen to run a few hospitals. And to be fair, it wasn't a one-sided holy charity operation. The Knights were kind of like pirates themselves. They attacked Muslim ships and they ransomed Muslim captives. It was more like a very long mutual pirate war between them and their Muslim neighbors. One that all sides happened to justify with religion. And everybody's hands were dirty here. Being professionally excellent at piracy put the Knights on a collision course with the Ottoman Empire, whose merchant ships kept getting relieved of their cargo as they sailed near Rhodes, coincidentally. And in 1522, a young sultan named Suleiman, yes, the same one that history would nickname the Magnificent, though at this point he was more mildly irritated, laid siege to Rhodes with an enormous army. The Knights fought hard and lost anyway, and Suleiman, in a rare moment of chivalry, let the survivors sail away with their weapons and dignity intact. And this would turn out to be one of the worst decisions he ever made in his life. Now, the Knights spent the next 7 years homeless, and they bounced around Europe like the world's most heavily armed couch surfers. And eventually, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V finally gave them somewhere to live in 1530. He gave them the islands of Malta, the island of Gozo, plus a North African port of Tripoli, for the grand annual rent of one falcon. A single literal bird handed over every year on All Saints' Day. Yes, this was actually the terms of the contract. Once the Knights settled back into Malta, they got started straight on their signature hobby, piracy. They were harassing Ottoman shipping with a fleet that at the largest numbered maybe 6 or 7 ships. But the pirate charity kept it up for about 30 years, right up until 1565, when Suleiman, now old, wildly successful, and thoroughly done being polite, decided to finish what he'd started at Rhodes, minus the mercy this time. He assembled one of the largest invasion forces the Mediterranean had seen in decades and pointed it straight at a rock you could ride a bicycle across in an afternoon. Little did he know that rock actually had a plan, and that plan's name was Jean Parisot de Valette. La Valette was around 70 years old in 1565, which in the 16th century should have meant a quiet retirement of complaining about his knees and back and probably yelling at younger knights. Jokes aside, it's an incredible age at that time to live and still be robust, which I think was a testament to the man's vigor. And instead of giving up, he was about to run the defense of the entire island, because La Valette was not a normal 70-year-old man. He joined the Order of the Knights Hospitaller when he was a teen, and he was at the Battle of Rhodes when he was a young man. And in fact, in 1541, He had his galley captured in a naval battle and landed him a full year as an Ottoman galley slave. The Corsair fleet that held him, and this is important to the story, was led by a man named Turgut Reis, better known as Dragut, and he became the single most feared pirate admiral in the whole Mediterranean at the time. A prisoner exchange set Valette free. Now, 24 years after that, Dragut sailed to Malta to help besiege Valette's island. And nothing brings two guys back together quite like a really specific multi-decade grudge. On the Ottoman side, command was split between two men who agreed on almost nothing. It's the story of two pashas. Admiral Pael Pasha ran the fleet and wanted it parked somewhere sheltered, which meant capturing the small fort guarding the harbor mouth, Fort St. Elmo. Mustafa Pasha ran the army and wanted to march straight inland and take the old capital right away. Instead, Sultan Suleiman gave them joint command with no tiebreaker. It's the 16th century version of two co-CEOs that can't agree on one single thing. This would turn out to be a complete disaster for the Ottoman side. Admiral Pasha ultimately won the argument, and on May 18, 1565, somewhere around 200 ships, depending on which historian you ask, and up to 48,000 men showed up off the coast of Malta. Ottoman military records suggest a core force closer to 25,000 regulars. Nobody agrees on the exact number, but everyone does agree that it was far too many men for that small island. The force was not only large, but also consisted of some of the most advanced military units of the age. Janissary troops, one of the first truly professional armies in that period, whose hobby was only permitted to be war until they reached the age of 40, who fought alongside unmounted Sipahis, which were similar to landed knights, and were accompanied by thousands of militia, levies, and otherwise cannon fodder. Waiting for them was roughly 500 knights of the order, plus a few thousand Maltese militia, Spanish soldiers, and pretty much anyone who could hold a spear. Somewhere between 6,000 to 9,000 people total. Best case, the defenders were outnumbered 4-1. Worst case, they were outnumbered 8-1. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I could fight 8 people at once. Even worse news for the Knights, some of the Ottoman siege guns were reported to be absolute monsters. Multi-ton cannons that could allegedly hurl stone balls mile through the air. Admiral Pasha took one look at the little fort, sized it up against his firepower, and told the Sultan it would fall in 3 days. Fort St. Elmo was never supposed to be the main event. It was a small star-shaped speed bump guarding the harbor entrance. The kind of position you post a skeleton crew at to focus on the real targets. But instead it turned out to be a month-long meat grinder for the Ottomans, and it nearly broke their war machine before the actual siege had even started. Eventually the pirate Dragut arrived at the end of May as well, with more ships, more men, and more cannons. He immediately took charge of the artillery placement because, pirate resume aside, the man genuinely understood siege warfare. And under his direction, the Ottomans were firing thousands of rounds in a single day in a fort that, by any reasonable military logic, should have folded within a week. It took an entire month. St. Elmo finally fell at the end of June in 1565, and it cost the Ottomans an estimated 6,000 men. A lot of them were their elite Janissary troops. Somewhere in the Ottoman camp, we can be sure that there were deeply uncomfortable conversations happening about what the big force across the harbor were going to cost if such a small one bled them so badly. And Dragut did not live to have this conversation, because while directing the bombardment of Fort St. Elmo, he was struck by a piece of shrapnel. And we don't know which cannon hit him, whether it was one of his own or one of the Knights' cannons. But we do know he died a few days later, mortally wounded. The reason why his death is important because many historians agree that if Dragut would have lived, the rest of the siege might have gone very differently. Because he was reported to be the one commander both Ottoman factions respected and listened to. The leadership went right back to disagreeing with each other at the worst possible moment. just having won their first objective. The Ottomans, lacking all leadership, decided to do something that was completely counterproductive and brutal. In order to scare the knights, possibly into surrender, the Ottoman troops beheaded the knights who were defending it, and lashed their bodies to makeshift crosses and sailed them across the harbor towards Birgu. A message to the defenders that if you do not surrender, this is coming to you next. This had the opposite effect. This brutality emboldened the defenders. They knew that if they surrendered, they would likely be slaughtered at this time. Valette completely skipped this message, ignored the threat. His response was equally as brutal. He had the Ottoman prisoners of war decapitated. He loaded their heads into cannons and fired their heads back into the Ottoman camp. And there's no version where anybody comes out looking good. It's not a heroic moment, but you can see where the siege is going. With St. Elmo gone, the Ottomans turned to the actual targets, the twin fortress towers of Birgu and Senglea, jutting into the harbor and linked, among other things, by a massive iron chain strung across the water to stop enemy ships from sailing in. And this is the part where Valette, a 70-year-old man who by every reasonable standard should have been supervising from a comfortable chair, put himself on the walls instead. Contemporaries describe him personally rallying troops mid-assault and refusing to retreat even when his own officers begged him to. In fact, when someone suggested that he take cover during a bombardment, which is a perfectly reasonable response, he apparently would treat it as a mild personal insult. The man was brave. Throughout the scorching summer heat of July and August, the Ottomans threw everything they had at the walls. They tried floating platforms to attack Senglea directly from the water. Repelled. They tried packing the defensive ditch around Birgu with bundled branches and makeshift bridges just to walk over it. This became known as the Battle of the Ditch. Also repelled, at a brutal cost to both sides. Eventually, a small relief force of a few hundred men snuck into Birgu in early July. Just enough to keep morale from completely collapsing, but nowhere near enough to change the actual math. And the math was ugly. By late summer, the defenders were down to a few thousand exhausted, mostly wounded men, running low on gunpowder and food, watching the promised reinforcements from Sicily not showing up. Ottomans weren't in great shape either. Disease, summer heat, and months of failed assaults had ground them down too. But they still had the bigger number. And all logic dictates that eventually the bigger number will win, unless something changes. Surprise, surprise, something was about to change. It was just taking its sweet time to get there. One day, the knights would have woken up and they would have seen ships in the distance. They would have seen the Gran Soccorso, a group of roughly 9,000 Spanish and Italian troops under the command of Don Garcia de Toledo, the Viceroy of Sicily. It had been on its way for months. Bad weather, slow logistics, and possibly a viceroy who really didn't want to commit until victory was assured. It finally arrived on September 7th, coming ashore on Malta's northern coast. That morning would have been shocking for the Ottomans. They would have woken up expecting another day of siege and eventual victory, instead seeing an army freshly rested that has seemingly come out of nowhere, right in front of them. Now, what happened next was that the Ottoman command, staring down a rested enemy, after 4 months of getting nowhere, completely panicked. On the night of September 7th and into the 8th, they began pulling out, abandoning artillery, taking further losses all the way to their ships. By the time the fleet finally limped out of Maltese waters for good, it was carrying only a fraction of the army that had arrived months earlier. In fact, today, September 8th, is still celebrated in Malta as Victory Day. The final numbers, depending on which number you trust, land somewhere between grim and almost unbelievable. Ottoman losses were estimated anywhere between 20 to 35,000 dead, against a defending side that lost roughly a third of its knights, which would be about 200, and about a third of Malta's entire population. Birgu and Senglea were left in complete ruins. Nobody won this in the way that an action movie will show you, but Malta survived it, and under the circumstances, that's a win.